Hey everyone, it's Miss Bell. So we are in Unit 1 still, and the other things we're going to be talking about for Unit 1 is the characteristics of life, the levels of organization in life, and the cell theory and viruses. So this video PowerPoint is what we're going to be talking about those things. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the characteristics or properties of life. So these are the things that all living things must have. And you have to have all of these things, not just one or two of them, to be considered alive. These things unify biology. Because biology is the study of life, we have to be talking about living things. So all living things are going to be made of one or more cells. So all living things are made of at least one cell, maybe many like you. All living things must be able to grow, develop, reproduce, and share a universal genetic code. I think we all understand what growth is. That's just getting bigger, maybe taller, maybe wider. Development you can think of as learning, like children develop how to walk. They learn how to walk. They develop their skills, being able to pick things up with their hands. That's development. You're going to be learning how to drive probably in the next few years. That is development. Reproduce. All living things have to be able to reproduce. They don't have to reproduce by themselves like you would in asexual reproduction. It could be sexual where they have to have two of the same species. Viruses are not considered alive because they cannot reproduce. Two viruses cannot reproduce. You have to have a virus inside of a host cell in order to reproduce. So it's not considered alive for that reason. And then this other part, share a universal genetic code. The genetic code is going to be DNA. Okay, so all living things are going to have a universal genetic code which contains DNA. They must also obtain material and use the energy from it. This is basically how they eat. So, one thing, you understand that you obtain material. You obtain a cheeseburger, you eat it, and then you use the energy from the cheeseburger. A plant is going to obtain sunlight and water and carbon dioxide, and it's going to use the energy from those things to make their own food. So all living things still are going to obtain some sort of material and use energy from it. Another thing is homeostasis. All living things must maintain a stable internal environment, and that is homeostasis. Homeostasis is having the right amount of stuff. So, for example, water makes up a large part of your body. So if you have too much water or not enough water, that can kill you. So you need to maintain a fairly stable amount of water, and your body does that by helping you urinate, and your kidneys know when to pull water in and get rid of water. So that's maintaining a stable internal environment. There's lots of ways that your body does that. Another thing that happens for all living things is they respond to other organisms and changes within the environment. And that's called interdependence. So, for example, a change within your environment, that's pretty simple. If it starts raining outside and lightning, what are you probably going to do? Most of the time, you're going to find shelter, and most animals will do that. So, you're responding to a change within your environment, the rain, the thunder, the lightning. We may also respond to other organisms. If a snake jumps out in front of you, you're going to respond somehow. Whether you jump back, you run away from it, or you try to kill it. Maybe you try to catch it. Everyone's going to respond differently. Animals respond to other organisms as well. Like a lion is going to respond to a gazelle nearby. If it's hungry, it'll chase it. Plants even respond to changes within their environment. Have you ever seen a plant that grows towards the sunlight? Like one side of the plant will be bigger than the other, and the plant's leaves will grow towards the sunlight. I have to rotate one of my plants at my house because of that. And then the last thing is, as a group, species change throughout time. They change over time, which is evolution. They evolve. So we can see how humans have evolved over time. We can see how other organisms through the fossil record have changed over time. One example of that is not necessarily something that you can see, but more behaviors. Behaviors of humans have changed in the last 100 years because of advances in technology and cars and planes and lots of different things, because we've had so many new inventions over the last 100 years. Think 500 years ago how different times were versus now. So even then, you might not see a physical change. That is a behavioral change. So we have evolved. So, like I said before, life is characterized by the presence of all of the properties at some point in the organism's life, not just one or two. So they don't have to do all those things all the time, but at some point in their life, they have to do all of those things. So cell structure and function. Like I said, all living things are made of cells. Maybe it's one cell, maybe it's many cells. So the cell is the basic unit of structure and function for all living things. Okay, so you can think of structure like its shape and function like its job. Okay, so you think about your lungs. Most people understand where your lungs are. Your lungs are very close to your heart. The reason why is because your lungs take in oxygen, and then it sends the oxygen into the blood. And what does your heart do? It pumps that blood to move that oxygen into every cell into your body, because cells cannot survive without oxygen. So the heart and the lungs are very close together. The shape of the lungs, and I'm not a very good artist, but you'll just have to go with me. The shape of your lungs helps allow them to expand so that they can take in as much oxygen as possible. We're going to pretend that's your heart. Not exactly anatomically correct, but and they're also going to be very close to the heart so that they can move that oxygen into the blood, and then that blood can go into the heart. So the shape of the lungs and even the shape of the heart, the structure, helps its function of moving the oxygen into all of your cells. Cells are tiny, they're microscopic, but they're very organized, and they have coverings called membranes. They also have organelles. Organelles are all the little parts inside of the cell that each have a job. We're going to be going over those cell organelles in a later unit. So a cell is basically the smallest unit capable of life. Anything smaller than a cell, like the organelles inside of a cell, they couldn't survive by themselves. Like a mitochondria wouldn't survive by itself. So lastly, you have unicellular organisms. So uni means one, and multi means many. So unicellular are made of one cell, multicellular are made of many cells, and you are multicellular. Bacteria would be an example of a unicellular organism. So that brings us to another characteristic of life, reproduction and inheritance. So we mentioned that all organisms are going to produce new organisms like themselves through reproduction. So this will be the same species usually. So a rabbit and a rabbit, like in the picture, is going to they will reproduce new organisms, possibly. Now, through reproduction, that's how the heredity information is passed to offspring. So that's called inheritance. Your hereditary information, is DNA. Okay, and that's why you are similar to your parents, because you got half of your DNA from your mom and half from your dad. And so you'll have some similarities between both parents. Now remember, DNA does not only contain your looks, it also has lots of other factors too. So just because you look like one parent doesn't mean that you don't have DNA from your other parent. You still have equal amounts from both parents. The DNA from the parent you look like might just be dominant, or like in my daughter's case, my husband and I both have dark hair. So who did she get it from? We both have dark hair, so kind of hard to tell. Whereas our eye color, I have light eyes and my husband has dark eyes. My daughter has dark eyes. So she clearly got that from him. And then later on, we'll talk about genetics and how some things are dominant over others, some traits. So reproduction is where you make more of your own kind, and they're passed down from one generation to the next. Reproduction is not essential for the survival of an individual. Okay, so one person, you don't have to reproduce to survive. But it is necessary to continue the species. If all the humans stopped reproducing, then the species would eventually not survive. But if only one chooses not to reproduce or is unable to reproduce, then it's not going to affect the species. It only is going to affect that person, just won't have children. So it doesn't impact the species. So if members of a group of living things fail to reproduce as a whole, eventually they become extinct. So if humans were to stop reproducing, or if they were to have something wrong with them where they could not reproduce, then that species could become extinct. One example is the bald eagles. We'll talk more in depth about what happened with the bald eagles, but they almost became extinct, not because they didn't try to reproduce, but because something humans did caused their eggs to break very easily. So fortunately, humans did intervene to try to correct their mistake or their problem that they caused, and the bald eagle population has come back. So inheritance basically goes back to DNA. So your DNA is your genetic code. Heredity is defined as the passing of traits from parents to offspring. This is you getting DNA from both of your parents. So you will have traits from both of your parents. All living things pass their traits to their offspring through the genes. Genes are just one tiny little section of DNA. So you have hundreds, even thousands of genes on one piece of DNA. Each gene contains the instructions for one trait. So you might have one gene that tells if you're going to get breast cancer, or if you have genetic breast cancer. For example, that's called the BRCA1 gene. So BRCA1. There's also a BRCA2 gene. But anyway, so that's just one gene that we can look for in a specific spot in your DNA to see if you have it. Now, can you get breast cancer if you don't have that gene? Absolutely. About 80% of breast cancers are not genetic, so they can't find a gene that causes it. Anyway, so you can have genes for eye color and hair color, and usually in humans, those genes are caused by more than one gene. Those traits are caused by more than one trait. But if you're a more simple organism, then it might be caused by one particular gene. So, your instructions, your genetic code, your genes are coded into the DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acid, and that helps determine your traits. So, DNA basically can tell us a lot of information about you. That brings us to metabolism, or energy. Metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions carried out in one living thing, in one organism. So a chemical reaction is going to be, for us, how we get energy. So that's our metabolism. Have you ever heard someone has a high metabolism or a low metabolism? That just is saying how fast you burn through energy or how fast you burn through food, because food is energy. So living organisms perform many different chemical reactions to obtain and use energy, and to run and to process info. So you're using energy even when you're asleep, because your brain has to move constantly, or not move, but your brain has to continually think to tell you to breathe, to tell your heart to keep beating, to tell all your other organs to do their job. So when you're asleep, all those things still happen. So they need energy to happen. So all living things use energy to grow, to move, and to even process information. Without energy, life will stop. You stop eating, eventually you will have no more energy. Life will stop. Fortunately, as humans, we store fat, and so fat can be burned for energy. So organisms that are highly organized, they maintain that internal order, that homeostasis. They require a constant energy supply. So even though you're not constantly eating, you do have a pretty constant energy supply. There are some conditions that might mess up this energy supply, like diabetes. That's why they have to take insulin, because maybe they have too much sugar in their blood. So that can make you very, very sick, because like anything else, too much of a good thing can cause problems. So this is the equation for, anybody know? Light. It involves light. So if I take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and I give off oxygen and sugar, who does that? Do you do that? No, you do the opposite. You take in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. So this is what plants do. This is photosynthesis. This is how plants get energy. They convert this light energy into sugar. And then the plants can use that sugar to grow or whatever they need to do. Animals can also eat the sugar in the plants. So some plants have more sugar than others. That's why they taste better. Stability and homeostasis. So we mentioned before that all organisms must maintain stable internal conditions. Okay, stable internal conditions can refer to a bunch of different things. Earlier I mentioned one, but I'm going to talk about a few others. Body temperature. If you're too hot, if you have too high of a fever, then that can kill you, right? For too long of a time period. But you can also die if you're too cold. That's hypothermia. So hypothermia would be when you're too cold. Hyperthermia would be fever when you're too hot. So generally we don't have, our body maintains a stable temperature because we're not sick. Usually hypothermia happens because you are in an environment that's very, very cold and your body can only maintain temperature for so long. And then, of course, a lot of the times we get fever if we're sick, or if you get very, very hot, like if you've heard of someone having a heat stroke. Chemical content. Have you ever been sick and they've told you that you needed to drink something with electrolytes? Chemical content is going to mostly refer to electrolytes like salt or potassium. If you go get IV fluids at the hospital, you're probably either going to be given, there's a couple different ones, but two of the most common ones are sodium bicarbonate and potassium phosphate, I believe is what it's called. And what they're going to do is they're going to check your blood and see which one of those that you would need more often at that time, not more often. Water. We mentioned dehydration earlier. You need water to survive. Too much water can actually cause your cells to burst. And too little water, your cells can't function. So you got to maintain a stable internal condition, internal environment, no matter what your external environment is. And that's called homeostasis, keeping that stable environment. So another example is breathing rate. If you're not breathing enough, you can die. If you're breathing too much, you can hyperventilate. Same thing with your heart rate. You don't want your heart to go too slow or too fast. Blood pressure, you don't want it to be too high or too low. Everything has a normal level. So you want to keep that homeostasis, that kind of normal level of things, so that you can be a healthy organism, a healthy human. And dogs, they pant rather than sweat in order to cool their body down. Response to organisms and changes in the environment. This is also known as interdependence. So interdependence is when organisms in one community evolve to live and interact with other organisms. Okay, so a biological community is a group of all the living things in one particular area. So a community would be all the living things in Van Cleve, Mississippi, maybe. Ecology is the study of the interactions of organisms with each other and their environment. So one thing ecologists study is how humans impact their environment, which a lot of the times can be negative. Sometimes positive, especially now. We're trying to help things, but a lot of the times we talk about the negative things that humans have done and how we can prevent any more negative things. So sunlight is the ultimate energy source for all organisms on Earth. Without sunlight, we wouldn't have energy from the sun to go to our plants, and then we wouldn't have a base of the food chain or food web. So energy from the sun is passed from one organism to another. So first the energy goes to a plant, a producer, and then it goes to a plant eater, an herbivore. And then that herbivore gets eaten by a carnivore. And then when that carnivore dies, when that lion dies, bacteria decomposers and other decomposers in the dirt are going to eat that carnivore. They're going to break it down back into the dirt. So that's kind of the general circle of life, as you would say. So an abiotic factor, so you remember the prefixes we talked about? A means without, and I hope you remember bio means life. So an abiotic factor is a non-living factor. Non-living things in our environment. Water is not alive, is it? But it's an important thing. We need it for life. Air, the atmosphere, we need oxygen, right? Plants need carbon dioxide. So the things in the air is important, but they're not living. So we call them abiotic factors. Energy, dirt, the temperature is important because some things can only survive in certain temperatures. And different minerals, like think about the multivitamin you might take. A biotic factor is going to be any living factor on Earth. Okay, so anything that's considered alive is biotic. The biosphere is any part of Earth that supports life, and it also includes both abiotic and biotic factors. So basically this is every biome on Earth that supports life. So like even the tundra and the desert, the rainforest, the savanna, we live in the deciduous forest, all those different places you probably learned about before. Those are part of they make up the biosphere. Responsiveness, I mentioned that organisms respond to changes, whether the change be to another organism or to their environment. So different organisms can have different specialized structures or even behaviors to respond to certain conditions or changes. So for example, what happens to the leaves of certain trees in the fall? They fall, right? That's why it's called fall, because leaves fall in the fall for certain types of plants. If it's a deciduous tree like an oak tree, leaves will fall once it starts getting colder. And that happens, that plant, that tree is responding to the environmental conditions in order to preserve its life. Another thing is all living things live in constant connection with the environment. That's going to be your air, your water, weather, temperature, other living things in the area. Even if you're sitting at your house and you don't leave your house for months, like if you're in quarantine, you're still involving yourself. You're connected with the air because you're breathing in the air and you're drinking water and you're still going to feel the weather, the temperature. So external environmental factors are considered stimuli, and they can cause a response from living things. When it gets cold outside, we tend to choose to get warm, unless you like the cold. I might put a jacket on or wear warmer clothing, and I'm probably going to turn the heat on. Organisms need to be able to respond to changes in order to stay alive and healthy. If it's 30 degrees outside, I can't stay outside all the time and remain alive and healthy. If I was to stay overnight in freezing conditions, I could possibly freeze to death or become hypothermic. So you have to respond to changes to stay alive and healthy. One example is a specialized leaf on the Venus flytrap senses the little footsteps of a little fly. And that plant is going to do what? Snap, eat the bug. Another example would be when you feel the cool wind blow, you're going to get chills. So think about the chill bumps that you get on your skin. And that's one thing that chill bumps do is that's actually caused by a little muscle inside of your hairs in your like your arms or your legs, and that little muscle is going to tighten up. And when muscles tighten, they actually generate heat. So that's your body's way of trying to warm yourself and get warmer by generating heat. Anyway, so organisms, other ways that they might respond to their environment is by fleeing, by leaving the area. They might not respond to their environment. They might end up dying, or they can adapt to the change. They might find shelter, find some way to live through the change. And the next characteristic of life is evolution. Evolution simply means change over time, and this refers to entire populations. A population is all members of a species. In one area at one time. So the bullfrog population in Vancleave, Mississippi in 2004. That would be a population of organisms. So we can see how they evolve, how they change over time. So natural selection is the big thing that we talk about with evolution. Natural selection is also known as survival of the fittest. Okay, this drives evolution. This causes change. When I say it drives evolution, I mean that it causes most of the change. If only the fittest for that environment survive, everyone else dies. You basically adapt or die. Those that don't adapt die out. Their traits don't get passed on to the next generation. If you're dead, you're not passing on your genes. So Charles Darwin is the father of evolution. So his big work was on natural selection, and he noticed that species that are best fit for that particular environment, which means they had the most favorable genes, they had the best genes for that environment, were better able to survive. If they survived, then they reproduced and passed those traits on to their offspring. So, a species is a group of genetically similar organisms that can produce fertile offspring. Notice the species doesn't say genetically the same, because you and I are not exactly genetically the same. We are very similar. We are the same species, but we're not exactly the same, or then we would be identical twins. So a key thing about a species is they have to be able to produce fertile offspring. So you might have heard of a mule before. A donkey mating with a horse makes a mule. You can have mules, but that mule will not be able to mate with another mule, so they're not considered a species. So the survival of organisms with favorable traits causes a gradual change in populations over many generations. Okay, so if you look over here at the picture of the rabbits, if you have this darker fur rabbit and lighter fur rabbit, so think about the environment. If the environment is going to be more icy, then the white rabbit will probably survive better because predators will not be able to see it as well. It will be more camouflage. But if your environment is not icy and more like woods or grasses, then the brown-toned rabbit will survive better. So what if one winter you have a really bad, tough winter and it snows the whole winter? Well, then all the brown rabbits might die out and you're left with white rabbits. Or what if the opposite happens? What if all of your, you don't have snow at all? Normally you're in an area with snow and you don't have snow. Well, then the white rabbits are probably going to get eaten and then you'll be left with more brown rabbits. So this is a gradual change where you'll see a trend over time. So evolution is driven by competition for resources. So whoever's best fit tends to survive. Whoever can find food, water, habitat, which is a home, reproducing mates, and even sunlight if it's a plant. Those things they compete for, and whoever wins the competition gets it. Let's say these rabbits have to compete with another herbivore, like a mouse or something, and whichever one outcompetes, they might be the one that actually survives. So let's talk about habitat. So birds might compete for habitat. If we have one tree in this area, then it's only going to have space to nest so many birds. So they could compete for space to nest. Same thing with plants. Plants can compete for space because they have to have space for their roots to grow. And they can compete for sunlight. So that brings us to cells. So cytology is the study of cells. So the prefix cyto means cell, and logy means the study of. Okay, so cytology is the study of cells. So the first person that actually discovered cells was named Robert Hooke. You do need to know any scientist that I'm stating. So Robert Hooke looked at dead plant cells. He looked at cork. Okay, cork that came from the bark of an oak tree. So he did not view living cells first. He viewed dead cells first. Now, I never say his name right, but Leeuwenhoek, I always struggle with his name. Anyway, he was the first person to observe living cells. Now, he did pretty much invent the compound light microscope, but he was the first person to observe living cells. And we'll talk more about both of those guys in a few minutes. In addition to those two, Schwann, Schleiden, and Virchow also contributed to the cell theory. And we're going to talk about the cell theory next. So this was in the 17th century. These are all important scientists that we're going to talk more about. Here you have red blood cells, which are called erythrocytes. They have a distinctive appearance where it kind of looks like a thumbprint. See how it kind of has the thumbprint look? That's what a normal red blood cell looks like. And later on, we'll talk about what will cause them to not look normal. So the first guy we're going to get in depth with is Robert Hooke. So he was English, and he was a physicist. So he wasn't just a cytologist. He studied physics. So this is in 1665. So that was a long time ago, 1665. He was the first person to observe cells using one of the very first, very crude compound light microscopes. So he is important because he's the one who named cells. Okay, so Hooke named cells. And he was the first person to view cells. And remember, like I said, they were dead cork cells. Okay, so he looked at the bark from an oak tree, basically. So it was not living cork. And when he looked at them, and they were plant cells. So plant cells are going to be squared off or rectangular. And I'm not a good artist, so just bear with me. And so the reason why he named it cells, because he said that it reminded him of the little square rooms at a monastery, like a jail cell, except he was talking about at a monastery. It reminded him of the rooms at a monastery, how each monk had their own little cell. So that's why he named them cells. The next guy is Leeuwenhoek. He was Dutch, and very shortly after, he observed living cells. So he did invent the compound light microscope, and he was a businessman. So he wasn't just a cytologist either, but he did invent the compound light microscope, or he's given credit for it. There were other microscopes before him, but he's given credit for the compound light microscope, which is what we primarily use in biology today. And of course, scientists have made the microscopes better and better and better over the years. So this was in 1674, and he observed different things in pond water. So if you think about pond water, I'm just underlining some key things. In pond water, you're going to find algae. You're probably going to find protists. Both of those things like water. and possibly bacteria and other microscopic things. You're not going to find red blood cells. Obviously, red blood cells, he probably looked at blood. But his first thing that he saw was pond water. And he knew they were living because they, anybody know? Moved. If it moves, it's alive. So that's how he knew they were living. So then you have Matthias Schleiden. So he came later on. He lived in the 1800s, and he was a lawyer. And then he decided he was going to be a botanist. He was German. So botany is the study of plants. Botany is the study of plants. So he was a botanist, and he looked at plant cells under the microscope. And one of the things he found was nucleuses, or nuclei for plural. So he's one of the first people credited with identifying nucleuses inside of plant cells. So he was a botanist, so he studied botany, he studied plants under the microscope, and eventually he concluded that all plants must be made of cells. He kept noticing that every one of them had these little squared off areas that looked like cells. So then he shared his findings with Schwann. Okay, so Theodor Schwann. So Schleiden and Schwann kind of got together and shared their findings. So Schwann, he studied animal cells, specifically nerve and muscle tissues. So he concluded separately that all animals are made of cells. And you can think of Schwann, swan. So he was the one who studied animals, and a swan, of course, is an animal. Okay, so he concluded all animals were made of cells, just from looking at them under the microscope so much. So when he collaborated with Schleiden, and Schleiden said, well, all plants must be made of cells, and then Schwann said, well, all animals must be made of cells, then they came up with, well, all living things must be made of cells then. So that brought us to one of the major points of this modern cell theory, and just cell theory in general. All living things are made of cells. So then you have Virchow. So Rudolf Virchow. He also lived in the 1800s. He was a doctor and a pathologist. So not only was he a physician, but he also studied diseases and, how people got sick. So he was German. So he's considered the father of modern cellular pathology. So he determined that as you become sick, your cells are where the disease come from. So as you become sick, your cells are where the disease come from. So I know I keep going back to the coronavirus, COVID-19, and we know that that virus infects our cells, and then your cells become sick. So that's where it starts. And then you don't start seeing symptoms until many, many cells are affected. Wow. So anyway, Virchow took Schwann and Schleiden's work and he extended it, and he suggested that every cell came from an already existing cell, a pre-existing cell. So he's the guy that came up with the idea that you came from your parents. Your parents were alive, and you came from your parents. For one bacteria to show up, it had to come from other bacteria. He helped disprove spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation is basically saying that life comes from inanimate matter. Spontaneous generation is the opposite of cells coming from other cells. So he helped disprove that. So the three main parts of the cell theory. All living things are made of one or more cells. The cell is the basic unit of structure and function in organisms. And then all cells come from the reproduction of pre-existing cells. So you must know these three things. You need to be able to write them out. So then we have modern cell theory. So you have your three main parts of the cell theory. Well, modern cell theory has added on a few other things. So this is, more modern science. We were talking about things that happened in the 1800s. Now we're getting into more current science that we've studied cells hundreds of years now, and we can add to it, add to the modern cell theory. So this is modern cell theory. Okay, so an organism's function depends on the function of its cells. So what you do depends on the function of your cells. If your cells aren't working correctly, your body's not going to work correctly. You ever notice when you get sick, you don't feel like you can do things as good as normal? It's because your cells aren't functioning as good, so your body doesn't feel like it can function as good. Another thing is chemical reactions happen inside of cells. So when you eat that cheeseburger, it eventually gets broken down. It goes through your stomach, you absorb it in your small intestine, it goes into your bloodstream. Eventually the bloodstream takes it to every cell in the body. And it takes maybe the sugar and the protein and the fat that was in that cheeseburger, and it goes into every cell. And then chemical reaction happen inside the cell for your cells to gain energy from that cheeseburger. So chemical reactions happen inside of the cells. Not in your stomach. Well, you do have some chemical reactions that happen to help break down your food. But the main chemical reactions are happening inside of cells. Another thing is your cells contain your inherited information in DNA. And DNA is passed from cell to cell. Okay, so you might wonder, or you might know, where is DNA located in the cell? Do y'all remember? You should have learned this before. So DNA is going to be in the nucleus of the cell, right? So we know that cells contain your DNA in the nucleus, if it's like a human cell. If it's a bacteria, they don't have a nucleus, so it's just floating in the cytoplasm. The last thing is that all cells are composed of the same biological building blocks. In Unit 2, we're going to be talking about those biological building blocks. And those are going to be carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So we're going to do a whole unit on those biological building blocks. But all cells are made of them. Think about it like this. All cells are made of the same atoms. Mostly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Those are the main ones. There's other stuff in you, but those are the main ones. So then you have cellular differentiation. It's a big word. So what that means is how you create different types of specialized cells. So in the human body, there's over 250 different kinds of cells. Okay, so that might be a liver cell or lung cells, or there's different types of blood cells. You get the picture. So you have over 250 different types of cell in the human body. Well, they weren't always that way. So as many of you know, I'm currently pregnant. So when a sperm first fertilizes the egg, then you get the embryo. I'm just going to draw a little human. There's first it's a zygote. So the zygote is really just the sperm and egg. Okay? It has to grow into a baby. So that zygote has to divide from 1 into 2, 2 into 4, 4 into 8 cells. And eventually you get a group of cells, which are tissues. Those cells are all going to be stem cells. They're called embryonic stem cells. And that's because it's at the embryo level. So embryonic stem cells have not decided what type of cell they're going to be. So stem cells are special cells that can differentiate into more specific types of cells. So this is like at the very, very beginning of pregnancy. So eventually that embryo is going to divide, and it's like exponential growth. It's growing super fast. I have a pregnancy app, and one of them said that I was making 100 brain cells a minute. Or no, maybe it was a second. I can't remember. But anyway, it was a lot of cells. So anyway, these cells are constantly dividing, and it's exponential growth. So you have the stem cells. All the cells start out as stem cells. And eventually you get the baby that has a heart, it has lungs. Those cells eventually become specialized into either heart cells or lung cells or brain cells or whatever they're going to be. So cellular differentiation is the process of stem cells becoming a specialized cell, like a liver or lung cell or bone or whatever. Stem cells can turn into any type of cell if it's a certain embryonic stem cell. So, during differentiation, a specific gene in the stem cell is either switched on or off, and that makes it pick what kind of cell it's going to be. Okay, so for example, every cell has the same DNA in it. In your body, every single one of your cells should have the same DNA in it. Okay, so you got all this DNA, but not all of the DNA is used at every time in each cell. So if you're a bone cell, for example, you're going to switch on, the DNA will be switched on. So while it's a stem cell, the DNA will be switched on for it to become a bone cell. And then the other cells will be switched off. The genes will be switched off. So it only activates certain parts of the DNA to make it become that type of cell. So some stem cells may become a stomach or a liver or a bone cell. And once it becomes specialized, once it becomes a bone, once it becomes a brain cell, it cannot go back. It can't go back to a stem cell. So stem cells are very valuable in research. They're very wanted in research. But ethics do come into play, and we'll talk about that more in depth later on. So multicellular organization. So this is like you're multicellular. How is your body organized? So we know the basic unit of life is cells. So cells are specialized to perform a specific function. Like we said, a liver cell does certain things, bone cells do certain things. So cells in a multicellular organisms depend on each other. Remember earlier I mentioned how the lungs and the heart depend on each other? Because the lung takes in the oxygen, but then the oxygen goes through the bloodstream into the heart. But the lungs depend on the heart to pump that oxygen throughout the body. And then the heart depends on the lungs to get the oxygen from the atmosphere. So they're all dependent on each other. So how an organism is organized starts out with cells. Then you get many cells, a group of cells or many cells performing the same function is going to be a tissue. Then when you get many tissues performing the same function, you will get an organ. Many organs performing the same function, you get an organ system. And then lastly, multiple organ systems, you get an organism. Okay, so here's a few pictures, an example. Okay, so if you look here, we have one cardiac muscle cell. Okay, and that one muscle cell is going to contract. Then you get lots of cardiac muscle cells that make up cardiac muscle tissue. So they're going to be contracting to help the heart pump. Then you get the organ, the heart. The heart is made up of multiple tissues. That's what makes it an organ. It's going to be made up of muscle tissue, but also the inside lining of the heart is not muscle. It's made up of a different type of tissue. And the outside lining of the heart is made up of different tissue. So there's different layers to the heart. So there's different tissues to the heart, which make up the organ, multiple different tissues. And then you have the organ system, which is made up of multiple organs. So the circulatory system you see will have more than one organs. So all your veins and arteries are organs, and then your heart. So anyway, the other is just here's just a picture of one cell, and this is just a picture of how you have one cell, and then one cell, if you have many cells, then you get a tissue, many tissues, the organ, many organs, organ system, then you get the whole organism. So tissues, like I said, are a group of cells, and they perform usually a specific function. Organs are going to be groups of tissues that are working together to do a function. Organ systems are going to be organs working together to carry out a whole life process. So here are some examples of animal tissues. So there's four main tissues. And muscle tissue, that's a pretty easy one. Muscles contract. You have three main types of muscle. Skeletal muscle, which is voluntary, so you kind of tell it when to work. Then the other two are involuntary. You can't tell when your heart beats, and you can't tell your stomach when to contract. Okay, so cardiac muscle is going to be only in the heart. Smooth muscle is going to be in other organs, like the stomach, the intestines, things like that, your bladder. So then you have nerve tissue. Nerve tissue sends signals. So it might be in your brain, your spinal cord, and your nerves. That one's pretty easy too. The other two are commonly mixed up. Epithelial tissue is going to be what lines or organs. Okay, so remember how I said the heart, the inside of the heart and the outside of the heart is lined? That's going to be epithelial tissue. If you take your tongue and run it on the inside of your mouth, you're touching the epithelial tissue. And then inside your mouth, you're going to have a muscular layer and a fatty layer, and then eventually you'll get to the skin layer on the outside. So epithelial tissue is usually like lining. And then you have the connective tissue. Connective tissue generally is going to connect things, but it also might support or protect. So bone is connective, blood is connective, the walls, like the outside of the heart, will probably be connective. Ligaments and tendons, cartilage, that all connects bones together, or muscles, bones, muscles together, so those are going to be connective. So here are some systems in the human body. I'm going to go through the ones you probably don't know is endocrine. Endocrine is like hormones. So you can see that there are some sex organs there, the testes and the ovaries. This is in the brain, the pituitary. That's the thyroid, which controls metabolism. A couple other organs there too. The pancreas, that would be like the hormone insulin that diabetics use. Lymphatic system, that's going to be like fluid. It goes along with your veins and arteries, but it helps drain fluid. So if you ever have any swelling anywhere, lymphatic system would include your lymph nodes, and it helps with your immune system. So then you have respiratory. I think y'all know that's breathing, urinary, digestive, reproductive, circulatory. All right, the only other one you probably are not familiar with is integumentary system, and that's skin. Okay, that's mainly your skin. All right, a few questions. A group of similar cells, so a group of cells performing a common function, what would you call that? A molecule, an organ, a tissue, or a compound? So if it's a group of cells, it's going to be a tissue. An organ will be a group of tissues. Okay, which of the following shows the correct order of arrangement from simplest to most complex level of organization? So you have A, organ, cell, tissue, organ system, or B, molecule, cell, organ system, C, cell, organ, tissue, compound, or D, tissue, compound, molecule, cell. Okay, so looking at A, is an organ smaller than a cell? Nope. Cells are smaller than organs, so I'm going to cross that out. Is a molecule smaller than a cell? Yes. Is an organ bigger than a cell? Yes. Is an organ system bigger? Yes. So this one could be correct. So is an organ bigger than a cell? Yes. Is a tissue bigger? No. These two should be flipped. And this should be at the beginning. So that's wrong. And then here, a cell would be smaller than a tissue, and a compound and molecule are both smaller than a cell. So that's incorrect. So the best answer here is B. A molecule is multiple atoms together. So again, a group of cells, I really don't have to read anymore because I know a group of cells is not an organism, because an organism is going to be a group of organ systems. I know it's not B, an organ, because an organ is a group of tissues. I know it's not C, a system, which is a group of organs. Sometimes you'll see system instead of organ system. So that brings me to D. A tissue is a group of cells. The eye is considered an organ. So I don't need to know about the eye. I just need to know what an organ is. Because are organs made up of different tissues working together? Why, yes, they are. So A is definitely the answer, but let's look at B. Requires light energy to function. Do eyes require light? No, they don't. That would be like plants. C, contains a fluid-filled central cavity. Yeah, they do, but that doesn't make it an organ. D, is almost completely surrounded by bone. Well, not almost completely. I mean, it is surrounded mostly by bone, but not totally, because the front is not bone, where you see out of. So that doesn't make it an organ. What makes it an organ is because it's made of tissues. Which of the following is ordered from simplest to most complex? So a very similar question. You need to notice how you got to put these in order. Okay, so is it A, tissue, then cell? System, organ, organism. B, cell, organ, system, organism, then tissue. Or C, cell, tissue, organ, system, then organism. Or D, cell, tissue, organism, system, then organ. Okay, so you should have picked cell, tissue, organ, organ system, organism. All right, that brings us to plant tissues. Plants do have specialized tissues because they're different than animals, and they do have organs. Some people don't know that plants have organs. So there's three main types of tissues in plants. Dermal. Derm means like skin. So on a plant, this is the outer part or the skin. Then you have ground tissue. Well, ground is going to be what is in the ground and comes out of the ground. So roots are in the ground and the stem comes out of the ground. So ground tissue, and then you have vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is on the inside of the stem and the leaves, and it's going to help transport the food and water throughout the plant. So the xylem is going to transport the water, the phloem is going to transport the food. Phloem, food throughout the plant. So those are the two types of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, transporting food and water. And vascular tissue, you have vascular tissue. They're your veins and arteries. Okay, so although plants don't have blood like you do, your blood transports food and water throughout your body. That's the purpose of it. So vascular tissue in plants also transports food and water. It's just not in the form of blood. So plants do have veins, and those veins are the vascular tissue. So the organs in a plant are very simple. They're the root, stem, leaf, and flower. Not every plant has all four organs. For example, not all plants make flowers. Only certain plants make flowers. So they might not have all four organs. A colonial organism is made of cells that live very closely together, but they're not considered, they don't have tissues and organs. So it's cells living close together, but they don't make up a tissue, because it would be like separately living things. An evolved example of that. So this is an example of a cross-section of some plants. So if you look, you have the dermal tissue on the outside. Then you have your ground tissue, which would help make up the root and stem. And then you have your vascular tissue in the middle. And same thing up here. This is a microscopic section. So you have your dermal tissue on the outside, and then your vascular tissue. And then in this case, your ground tissue would be in the center. And it depends on the type of plant you're looking at.